Hey, how you doing? My name is MK0. Cross the line. And before I start giving my opinions on the current state of professional wrestling and anything about professional wrestling, I think it makes the most sense for me to talk about my history with professional wrestling first. And I've actually been looking forward to this. I have been watching professional wrestling since I was a baby. Two for two. And it's something that's been a part of my life forever. So I figured that would give a good background as to, why I feel the way I do about the business in its current state, some of the historical moments that I've lived through in the world of professional wrestling. And also to give a good bit of context when you start hearing me complain about how I remember when the Canadian Destroyer was a kill move, but I'll get to that at another time. So let's start. Like I said, I've been watching since I was born because my dad watched it. My dad watched it with his parents. So even though I wasn't around to watch it personally, I got to hear a lot of stories about guys like the original World's Strongest Man, Ken Patera, Dominic DeNucci, the original Rock, Don Morocco, and of course, the greatest Italian to ever live, the living legend Bruno Sammartino. As you can tell by all the names listed, we were a WWF household because at the time, that was the territories days. So that's what they watched. They watched the territory that they were in. And when I was born and started, actually starting to absorb some of it, old enough to understand what I was looking at, I'm ashamed to admit it now, but yes, I was a little Hulkamaniac. Now look, at the time, I was 3, and we didn't know the stuff that we know now about Hulk Hogan. We didn't know about the racism and the being a really horrible person and the that doesn't work for me, brother. But yeah, thankfully I grew out of that pretty quickly. Also at that time I was also a big fan of The Ultimate Warrior, which again, we didn't know at the time about the horrible stuff that he did and his opinions. And again, I was 3. So, but that's when I started watching. And I've always been around it ever since. I wasn't watching it as religiously during the Monday Night Wars era. Again, by that time, I was a little bit too young to really have a stronger connection with it. And also my parents, rightfully so, did not want me watching, the content that was getting put out on a weekly basis at that young age. As I got older, they let up and let me watch more and more of it, understanding don't say any of this stuff in school because you're going to get in trouble. And I understood that. But even besides that, I still have vivid memories of being able to catch the first couple hours of, or the first hour, excuse me. This is back when Raw was only 2 hours. It was better than the first hour of Raw, recording it on my VCR, watching SmackDown. I recorded a lot of stuff on the VCR and then just watched it later. Kind of says a lot about my viewing habits. But again, fond memories of watching Stone Cold Steve Austin stunner Vince McMahon every other week, watching The Rock in his prime, in his element, Mankind being both unbelievably insane and really funny all at the same time. And of course, watching Triple H be the absolute worst person ever, just being awful. I mean, actually, second worst person ever. Big Boss Man took the trophy for absolute biggest shithead in that era. I'll say this now and with full confidence. What they were able to put on television back then, you would not be able to put on television now. And in some cases, certain companies have tried, and it did not go well. As great as the Attitude Era was, the things I just mentioned were kind of the main highlights that everybody remembers. There were some low points, some really low points. I can't say much about WCW at the time because, again, we were a WWF household, just kind of out of habit. I knew about WCW, but I didn't watch it at the time. I ended up watching all of that stuff later on when I had access to it. One thing I will say is that Vince McMahon got lucky. That is my opinion, and I'm standing to it. He got lucky. He realized that he had two generational talents in Steve Austin and The Rock, and sort of let them do their thing, and that kind of carried the company to success. Also, WCW was horribly mismanaged and died essentially to no fault of its own, but a massive merger and Jamie Kellner. And this is where we enter the brave new year of 2001, when WCW and ECW, which, by the way, I was not aware of at all at the time, aside from a couple of offhanded mentions here and there, both of them went under. So WWF, then WWE later on, was the only game in town. And boy, were those early years not that good. You know, my viewership kind of slipped then. I wasn't watching it as regularly, but I was still keeping up with it as best I could. This was before the internet was what it is now, so it was a lot harder then. Luckily enough for me, in 2005, my cousin mentioned that another company had started up, TNA, and this was my first experience with independent wrestling, and that style that was starting to take over the wrestling sphere, and I was hooked immediately. Luckily for me, my cable provider did have Fox Sports Net, so I was able to watch TNA Impact in its early days. And it was an interesting product, to say the least. Quick matches, the FSN, like the Fox Box timer, was a really interesting sight. The presentation was so unique. And of course, the six-sided ring, which again, I had never seen before at the time. Talking about this stuff now, I'm going to mention, there weren't a lot of people who watched wrestling in my school, in my area. Maybe lucked out and found maybe one or two people, but there weren't that many. Again, here I am discovering this brand new company and basically being one of the few people who knew about it or even bothered with it. So it was an interesting time. But anyway, that style of wrestling kept me hooked. It was something new and interesting. I really enjoyed it. And of course, at the time, you're talking about TNA wrestling, you got to talk about AJ Styles, the phenomenal one. When I saw him wrestle for the first time, I was like, holy crap, that's my guy. Instantly. And thanks to Wikipedia existing and the internet being a little more closer to what it is now, I was able to sort of go down the rabbit hole and discover more companies. So I'd look up AJ Styles. I say, AJ Styles, oh, he works for TNA, and he also worked for Ring of Honor. Oh, wait a minute. Ring of Honor? What's Ring of Honor? And I'd look that up, and Ring of Honor's another independent promotion. Guys like Low Key and Bryan Danielson and Samoa Joe. Christopher Daniels, who also wrestled for TNA. And I'd say, wow, who are all these guys? And then it would list more guys and more companies that they worked for. And it was just so easy to get hooked on it. And again, this was just at the time when it was starting to get easier to find footage of all this wrestling on the internet. It was all starting to get out there. It was very easy to watch clips from Ring of Honor, CZW, PWG, and see all this new and interesting professional wrestling that up until then I had no idea was out there. And it was, again, just so new and interesting. And boy, this story gets depressing because then 2009 rolled around and TNA was doing okay. Like, they were actually making a profit. They were on the up and up. And then 2010 hit. Brother. Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff show up, and almost immediately everything goes downhill. So to see this company TNA wrestling that I enjoyed watching so much, that I became such a fan of, that had so many of what will become my favorite wrestlers just go straight to shit. Ah, that sucked. If it wasn't for Ring of Honor and finding out about more independent promotions, I probably would have stopped being a fan, because even during that period, WWE sucked. Like, at this point, SmackDown 6 era had already happened. We had already gotten a couple of the big WCW signings into WWE who didn't show up during the invasion because they were making so much money sitting at home doing nothing. And I don't blame them. Those Turner contracts were very lucrative. But even then, even with TNA gaining momentum, signing bigger stars, and even making money, starting to, WWE was still on top. They were still the top. They were the only game, basically. If you wanted to make it as a professional wrestler, you were aiming for WWE. And they knew it. And this is when they're at their worst, because WWE at the top means that they're playing to an audience of one. And that audience is the crazy old man running the company. I mean, I'll go into specifics at another time about Vince McMahon and just how much of a friggin' mental case he is. But WWE was still the number one promotion, playing to the audience of Vince McMahon doing whatever the fuck he wanted. And then, again, 2010, Hogan and Bischoff kill TNA, essentially. It becomes Impact Wrestling, and it just fizzles out. And by 2014, all the guys that anybody actually cared about in TNA were gone, including AJ Styles. And he went to New Japan Pro Wrestling, something that I was somewhat familiar with, had seen clips of here and there, but wasn't fully immersed in. But my favorite wrestler, AJ Styles, is going there, so I'm going to follow him. And it turns out that was the right call. 2014 was the year of independent wrestling for me. Was Ring of Honor being really good, New Japan being really good, and just indie wrestling in general sort of hit a boom period then. So needless to say, my love of wrestling was saved in 2014. And I've been an avid follower and viewer of all sorts of professional wrestling ever since then. And it's a good thing that those existed too, because, again, at the time, WWE sucked. Well into the Super Cena era, just any wrestler that had any sort of name value outside of WWE was getting signed and then completely destroyed until NXT started, which is where we all got our first glimpse of Triple H as a wrestling booker who's running the show, and we all collectively went, why the hell isn't he running everything? Because unlike WWE, NXT, their at the time developmental system, now it's kind of like a third brand when they want it to. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. NXT was really good. NXT was basically WWE's own in-house independent promotion, because they signed all the popular independent wrestlers that were gaining any traction, which, yeah, it sucked for the independent scene, but still, NXT was really, really good. Kevin Steen was fantastic in Ring of Honor, and he was fantastic in NXT. El Generico was fantastic in Ring of Honor, and then he went to go run that orphanage in Mexico, and then Sami Zayn showed up out of nowhere, and he's really good in NXT. They're both really good even now. But up until that really good NXT era, anytime you'd hear about someone getting signed to WWE, I was immediately filled with dread, because it was always the same song and dance. They'd show up, they'd get rebranded, they'd maybe get a win or two here and there, and then they were just losing all the time. And then they were gone. So even to this day, I still have a little bit of like a PTSD reaction when I hear about someone from the independents signing with WWE. You know, that knee jerk sort of, oh, this independent wrestler has signed with WWE. And just, no, don't do it. But then I have to remember, oh, wait, things are better now. And they are really. Aside from the fact that there is so much wrestling out there, so many different kinds of it, and it is all so easily accessible, that's going to be a whole separate thing, because I could get into that as well. But we're in a strange era now, because for the first time in a long time, WWE is good. Who'd have thought? And all it took was getting Vince McMahon the fuck out of there, which I can't even joke about saying who'd have thought. No, we knew that was the issue. We knew. And that's just sort of a general timeline of my history with professional wrestling. I'm going to go more in depth in their own separate entries on a lot of the bigger moments, but I just wanted to give kind of a little bit of a background that, you know, I lived through the Monday Night War, through WWE being the only game in town, the rise and hard fall of TNA, Ring of Honor going through its renaissance, cooling off, and then having another huge renaissance alongside New Japan, and then the formation of AEW, which has only been a positive for the industry as a whole. And that's, again, separate topic that I could go into, and I will. But yeah, I've been watching for a long time. I've seen a lot. I've seen a lot of wrestlers come and go. I've seen guys who were touted as the future of the business, and I got to see that both come true for some and not pan out in the slightest for a lot of other ones. I miss Chris Harris. I thought Chris Harris was going to be a bigger deal. Again, this is just the general timeline of it. This is all things I could get to more in depth later on. And again, I plan on it. I've watched professional wrestling as a whole evolve. I've watched the styles of wrestling change. I've seen all these different match types and wrestling styles, and what would become popular and what wouldn't. And I'm a guy who likes variety. I enjoy all of it. You give me a technical classic or a lucha libre high-flying match. You give me a spot fest, a hardcore match, a comedy match. I'm enjoying it because I love variety. And the cool thing about professional wrestling is when it's done right, it's the best thing in the world. But when it's done wrong, it is the absolute worst. Again, I lived through 2010s of professional wrestling, of the Vince McMahon illegitimate son angle and the anonymous Raw general manager and Immortal, or the guest host era, or just there was a lot of garbage in wrestling. The fact that wrestling survived the 2010s is a miracle in and of itself. So don't you tell me that AEW is like WCW in the year 2000. It's not. It's not even close to TNA in the 2010s. It isn't, and I'm very thankful for that, and I hope everybody else who enjoys professional wrestling is thankful for that as well. Because, again, we are in a golden age of professional wrestling now, where so many promotions have their content readily available for free for you to enjoy whenever you want. It's a beautiful thing. And I'll say this, keep an eye on those promotions, on those smaller promotions, on the independents, because that's where your new favorite wrestler is right now. That's where Seth Rollins, CM Punk, Daniel Bryan, AJ Styles, Kenny Omega, Will Ospreay, Mike Bailey, all these guys. I've had the privilege to watch them start out and reach these huge heights in their careers. And now there's another crop of talent. There's always another crop of talent on the independents. Keep an eye on them. You never know who's going to be the next biggest wrestler of all time. Anyways, so there you have it. My history with professional wrestling. So now there's a little bit of context for some of my opinions and feelings moving forward. Like how everyone needs to stop kicking out of so many goddamn finishers all the time. But anyways, comments are open. Let me know your history in professional wrestling. You know, how long have you been watching? Who are some of your favorites? I'll go into my favorite wrestlers in its own separate thing. As always, I'd like to thank you very much for listening. You take care.